Hello, I'm Rachel Berger. I'm the chair of CCA's graphic design program and a member of the Decolonial School. My colleague Suzanne Cockrell, who you'll be hearing from later in the video, is Associate Professor of Community Arts at CCA and also a member of the Decolonial School. The Decolonial School is an interdisciplinary group of CCA faculty working on building a new curricular model for art and design education that foregrounds Indigenous practices and acknowledges decolonization as a continuous process. As part of our work, we've been thinking about practices for faculty to consider integrating into their teaching that support CCA's commitment to equity, inclusion, and decolonization. In this video, we will be talking about community agreements. Community agreements are a list of values collectively written by a group of people. They are sometimes called community guidelines or shared agreements. Community agreements define how a group's members will communicate with each other and work together. They are social agreements that prioritize inclusion, accountability, and respect. Now Suzanne is going to share some examples of community agreements.
In our spring 2020 sculpture tutorial, Brian Conley and I worked with our students to create a list of community agreements entitled How We Speak Together. What do we want from this class community? Some agreements were lofty, like support radical cultural collisions in cultural production. Others were more informal, like eat together, as a way to build community. I like this example from Alicia Gardena's norms for engaging in anti-racist work. Inevitably, there are voices in the classroom that tend to be quieter and others that tend to be louder, so it's crucial to bring up the notion of calling ourselves out of and into the conversation. In my classes, we often discuss how everyone is responsible to call the quiet voices in and call themselves out if they tend to speak more and take up more space. This also brings up important issues around privilege, gender, language, learning style, and who feels they can speak in the classroom. At CCA's Decolonial Unconference in February 2020, our colleague Shalini Agrawal facilitated a conversation about community agreements. A suggested list of agreements was included in the printed program, and participants had an opportunity to discuss and revise them. Agreements included stay engaged, remove distractions, and access needs in order to be present. Be willing to be messy and stay flexible. Learning and growing can feel uncomfortable. Speak from the I. Speak from your own lived experience. Community agreements can be helpful in several ways. They build trust. They demonstrate a commitment to equity within the classroom because everyone's perspective is valued. They help students find their voices and express their opinions from the very first class meeting. They surface different people's preferences and priorities. They frame behavior and establish a shared understanding of a group's rules of the road. They create accountability and serve as a reference when a member of the group is not following them. Community agreements are often created through a facilitated conversation, ideally one that happens in your first or second class meeting. Wait until the students have warmed up a bit and seem ready to participate in a substantive conversation. Introduce it as a discussion about the way we're going to talk and listen and work together, about defining what we want from this community. You may find that students have done something like this before, in high school or in other contexts, and they already have an intelligence about how to listen and be together in a critique or a discussion. It's important to build your community agreements with your students. This is more effective than having your students do it themselves or presenting them with a list and inviting their feedback and buy-in. When authorship is shared, so is accountability. As facilitator, try to draw everyone into the conversation. As you record their input, confirm you understand their intent, and don't assume that everyone is aligned in their values. This builds trust and gives people permission to challenge each other. Our colleague Juan Carlos Rodriguez Rivera brings lightness to the creation of community agreements. He asks pairs of students to come up with some agreements together and present them to the class. Once everyone is on board, the students find gifts to represent those agreements. The gifts also open a conversation about cultural representation, appropriation, and digital blackface.
Some groups align on a handful of agreements, others write many more. The number is not as important as the effort to hear, recognize, and include input from everyone. Sometimes, as a facilitator, you will help clarify what someone is saying or find opportunities to simplify and combine ideas. The key is to write everything down, to write it together, and to have something to look at together. Think of your agreements as a living document. Share them with your students so they can refer to or reflect on them throughout the semester. These agreements can be particularly useful during critical moments in the semester, like if there is tension in the class or right before a critique. They are also a great reflection tool to use during a project or course debrief. You can ask your students whether the agreements were useful and whether there is anything they want to add to them. Community agreements are probably even more important for remote classes. When we're teaching and learning online, there are many opportunities for miscommunication and misunderstanding, and a great need for constructive ways to make meaningful connections between people. For example, your agreements could address whether students will turn their video feeds on or off during Zoom meetings. Your students may have things to say about this that you have not thought of, and that will be helpful. Try developing agreements in a shared document that students write in, or using a mural whiteboard. They could be done in small groups. They could be done as an assignment where students are asked to contribute agreements for a useful, dynamic learning environment. If you are interested in learning more about the Decolonial School or getting involved, please email decolonialschool@cca.edu.